Hello, my name is Szymon Bijak from the Faculty of Forestry, Warsaw University of Life Science. Today's topic is dendroecology. Basically, we may say that we reveal what trees or other plants want to tell us. They want to tell us their story. There is a special approach to different information that can be obtained from the special structures that plants develop during their life, the tree rings. And the concept is that trees can be, or other plants can be treated as archives of different ecological conditions, environmental situations. Trees or plants can live for a very long time. They can achieve huge dimensions, like Sequoia sempervirens, you see on the left picture. These trees are tall, they are also thick. But sometimes in very unfavorable conditions, like on the desert parts of the United States, we may find species like Pinus aristata. These specimens are very small. They are not tall, they are not thick, but they are very old. Both species and many others record the information about environment, the conditions, the climate, the moisture, pests, or human activity. They record this information in structures called tree rings. The method that can reveal the information, the science that focuses on tree rings, is called Dendrochronology. The name comes from three Greek words: dendron meaning tree, chronos meaning time, and logos meaning science. Dendrochronology is the art, the science that uses tree rings to determine time and to date the wooden objects, to estimate their age, to estimate when these pieces of material was created. Basic application of dendrochronology of tree rings is dating of wooden objects. We can date buildings, we can date smaller structures like violins, like treasure chests, or paintings. And the advantage of this method is that tree rings provide more precise dating, more precise information about when the given object appeared. For example, there is a well-known paleo settlement of Biskupin. When it was discovered before the Second World War, there was a huge debate when this structure was built, when people created this settlement, when they lived in these buildings. The answer was given after the war and was not very satisfactory. When radiocarbon dating was used, it gave the information, as you can see here, this period. Almost 400 years of time span for dating when the settlement was built. But finally, researchers decided to go for dendrochronology, and the information, as you can see, is much more precise. now we have only 25 years of the time span. And when we focus on the frequency of the dates, we know that majority of trees that were used for the construction of Biskupin were felled in the winter between those two years. Of course, we've got the other days as well, which means that the wood was used again, or some parts of the buildings or the pavement or the walls, as you can see on the pictures here, they were reconstructed. Some corrections were made, or new buildings, additional buildings were created. When we apply classic dendrochronology, which focuses on dating, to various fields of the research, when we correlate information hidden in tree rings with environmental parameters, we achieve the wider understanding of dendrochronology. And it is known as dendroecology, which includes information hidden or recorded by the trees about different parts of environment. So this ecology part of the name says so. As you can see on the slide, there are different sub-disciplines of dendroecology, and there's plenty of them. And almost each day, new concept, new application appears. The frontiers of application of tree ring studies constantly get wider and wider. But talking about dendroecology, it's good to know who started, who invented this field of science. So, although people in ancient times already knew that there is some kind of correlation, coincidence between environmental conditions and how the trees grow or plants grow, first notes about or records about scientific research concerning what we now may call dendrochronology or dendroecology were made by Leonardo da Vinci. But he is not the inventor of this discipline. The guy in the middle, Andrew Ellicott Douglas, American astronomer, he is responsible for inventing this science. He was the astronomer. He worked with the sunspots, and he asked himself a question: can I say something about past solar activity? Not 20 years ago, but much further in time. And he asked himself, perhaps such information can be hidden in trees, because the more active the sun is, the more energy, the more radiation comes to Earth, which means that it's warmer here. And the warmer conditions, probably the better conditions for trees to live, to grow. And he started to drill trees to obtain increment cores and compare number of sunspots with the width of tree rings. The third guy you see on the right, Fritz Schweingruber. He was a Swiss scientific man. He expanded what Douglas invented to new fields. He introduced shrubs and herbs as a source of information, of dendroecology information. He also started the research in many new areas, like in the Arctic or in the high mountains. Basically, he moved our science in great direction. Plant growth. What I wanted to talk about now is the biological basics of the dendrochronology. Trees or plants in general expand their dimensions due to two types of growth. Primary growth, which is connected with the lengthening of a plant, and we may say that this is the growth and increment of height. So the primary growth is covered by apical meristems and connects with getting higher. But we also have the secondary growth, which means that diameter of plant or its girth expands. And those two types of growth, primary and secondary, the height and the diameter growth, they coincide. They happen at the same time. Sometimes one is more profound, and trees or plants invest more in getting higher than getting thicker. Sometimes in specific conditions it's easier or more important for a tree to get thicker than to get higher. All those growths happen all the time through the lifespan of a plant, and when they stop, then tree dies. The product, especially of secondary growth, is a tree ring. Tree ring is a layer of wood that every vegetation season is produced and appeared around the plant. Along its girth, new rows of cells of wood appear, constituting something we call tree ring. In our conditions, in temperate zone, this happens year by year. But in tropical conditions, it happens in a different time periods, when it's more or less moisture, when there is more or less moisture, for example. We distinguish different types of tree rings, which is related to the type of species that produce these rings. For coniferous species, it's quite easy to distinguish or to determine the tree ring because we clearly can recognize early wood, which usually is more pale, and the late wood, which is more dark. And when we add these two types of wood, early wood and late wood, we came up with the total, the whole tree ring. So 1 year, one vegetation period of growth starts here at the edge. The early wood is produced at first, then the late wood with thicker cells, thicker walls at the end of the vegetation period. For broadleaf species, the situation is more diverse and more complex. Ring porous species produce similar structures to the conifers. We can distinguish rows of vessels that are created in the early wood part. And then there is also a packed structures of late wood. But we can distinguish more or less easily the tree ring, one single tree ring, indicated here with the red arrow. But we also have diffuse porous species. And in this case, trees, plants also develop tree rings, but it's very difficult to distinguish them. The vessels are distributed in the whole tree ring, so we cannot very easily divide where the early wood or the late wood is. We have many difficulties with indicating where the boundary between the ring is, between two consecutive rings is. So basically, for diffuse porous species, we try to use more wood anatomy methods for distinguishing rings. We are talking about the tree rings, but not only trees develop structures like these. Here we have blueberries, which also can produce tree rings. As you can look closer to the picture on the right, you can distinguish these circular structures that can be identified as a tree rings. Such a tiny plant can have up to 50 ring structures, and as you can see, the dimension here is very, very small. But something which we may call tree ring or annual ring is present. Far in the north or high in the mountains, we have also possibility of finding structures that resemble tree rings. We see now the cross-section of Arctic willow, the species that utilizes the conditions of growth, favorable conditions of growth that lasts 2 weeks, maybe 3, in a very good situation, 1 month, of enough energy, enough moisture to produce new structures, to expand own dimensions. And you can see here, indicated with dots of different colors, structures that are connected with consecutive vegetation periods. We call them also tree rings or annual rings, but we bear in mind that these structures were developed in a very short period. But when you look closer, you see that these color indications appear not on the whole girth of or circumference of the plant. Plants don't produce wood on the whole circumference because they don't have enough resources for it. They produce so-called partial rings. Sometimes there are also such situations that conditions of growth were not very favorable, or even the growth was impossible to be carried on, and there is no ring. So we called such a situation a missing ring, which makes the research very complicated. But the satisfaction of finding such a structure is very high. What kind of parameters we use in dendrochronology and dendroecology? Very different. The situation started with tree ring width, and later on another new parameters were added to the scope of the research. Early and late wood width or proportion, wood density, some anatomy features, also different anomalies like interannual density fluctuations or eccentric growth, and new techniques recently developed that concern the content of various isotopes or identification of the contents of blue light in the reflectance of the image of a structure of the tree ring surface. Basic product of tree ring research is chronology. Chronology is a series of information about the tree rings that are related to time. For each part of the wood, of this structure we call tree ring, we assign the calendar year. And having known this, we may relate these parameters, tree ring parameters, to the parameters of environment. We can distinguish different types of chronologies basing on, for example, space, the space coverage. So we may distinguish site chronology, which refers to the very specific place, local chronology or regional chronology, which cover wider areas. Sometimes when climate conditions are reconstructed for the whole hemisphere, such a widespread chronologies are also constructed. If we look closer to the type of the data which is used for the chronology construction, we can distinguish raw, standard, and residual chronologies. Raw chronologies, these are series of the measurements. So we have the parameter, we measure, we determine for our tree rings, and relating it to time, we achieve the raw chronology. Standard and residual chronologies are developed from the raw chronologies by different mathematical computations. Why we do it? There is a natural process, there is a natural age-related trend depicted here, as you can see. In the thinner line, you see tree-ring widths. So over the time, at the beginning, we have wider wings. Trees produce wider structures, the growth is bigger. And over the time, it goes down and down. In a typical situation, over the time, the amount of wood that is developed by the tree around its circumference is decreasing. This is natural situation, and we shouldn't relate it to the worse conditions of growth or that tree is weaker. And for analyzing influence or impact of various conditions, we have to remove this trend, and we do it during the detendrization procedure. The effect of the detendrization is standard chronology, and when we remove also the autocorrelation from the standard chronology, we end up with the residual chronology. And such a series of indexes, growth indexes, can be related to environmental parameters. We believe that during removal of this age-related trend and autocorrelation, we retain and enhance the year-to-year variation and information caused by the environmental factors. Another interesting parameter which very often is determined in our chronologies are pointer years. Pointer years are years when majority of trees or plants on a given site exhibit remarkably different higher or lower growth than in consecutive years before or after such a year. So looking at the increment curve or other piece of wood, in order to find pointer years, we are searching for the structures that stand out from the others. And as you can see here, we've got very narrow ring here, almost on the left side of the picture of this curve. And rings that were developed earlier, they are on the left, and which were developed later, they are on the right, are wider than this peculiar ring. And the year in which this tree ring was formed is called the pointer year. We can distinguish negative and positive pointer years. At this picture you can see the negative pointer year because this tree ring is much more narrower than the neighbors. In case this ring was wider, we would say that this is the positive pointer year. So positive wider rings, negative narrower rings. Dendrochronological standard or master chronology, that's a product, that's a tool used for dating. That's a reference. That's a reference like a code bar in shop which allows to determine the price of the product. And in our case, this dendrochronological standard allows dating of a piece of the wood. We compare the course of the tree-ring width in a given piece of the wood with information recorded in the dendrochronological standard. And this allows to suit our chronology of the object we want to determine the age, fit this piece of the chronology to the certain time, basing on statistical procedures. How we develop dendrochronological standard? We use material from different sources, from living trees, from the old buildings, or even from the archaeological excavations. Everything which goes back in time is useful, as far as we can find the overlap of the given material, of the peculiar material, with our master chronology. In this way, we extend our chronology, master chronology, towards the past. And what is also important, such a standard, such a master chronology, should be well replicated. So we should have a remarkable number of trees or chronologies from the wood used for the construction to cover particular time. If the chronology is well replicated, we believe that it bears the information, the common information for a given region. Of course, we can build standards for wider regions, wider areas, but they will have weaker ability to help in dating of the given piece of the wood from the certain place. The best solution is to have the standard for a relatively small area, but not always it's possible. Cross-dating. Basically, I described how you cross-date in talking about the master chronology. So it's a very important procedure. Every dendrochronological or dendroecological analysis starts with cross-dating. We determine the year, the calendar year, in which each tree was developed, formed, and we use it. We use the master chronologies or the other informations to achieve this goal. So that's the start. We begin our analysis with cross-dating. The concept that allows using dendroecology in environmental studies is Uniformitarian Principle. One of the authors is James Hutton. This concept appeared in the geology at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 19th century, and to shorten the story, the concept is that what happens now more or less happened in the past in the same way. So processes that we can observe today, they proceed in the same or very similar way that in the past and also in the future. and in different parts of the world, the same processes proceed and result in the same way. So having information from one place allows us to estimate or extrapolate this knowledge for the other places and times. But it's not always easy task, as plant growth is not driven by only one factor. The growth is a complex process that results from influence of various factors. The growth of plants, as suggested before, is related to this age-related growth trend, and one of the most remarkable factors is climate. Climate influences the growth of plants in a great measure. But the other disturbances or the other factors, either endogenous or exogenous, so happening within the plant or outside of the plant but influencing it, also have the substantial role in final product, which we call the tree ring. How we can get this information about tree rings? So we need some equipment. The basic tool we use is increment borer, which is very simple but efficient. You drill with this tool into the tree or into the plant and extract the piece of the wood from it. This is not invasive method. Plants survive, but we can always put some anti-fungi substances just to protect the specimen from getting sick. We also use chainsaw if we have bigger material, source material to get the increment cores or cross sections. We use such a wooden sticks to store the material. So the increment cores are glued to these wooden sticks and stored in the laboratory. The coolest part is always the field works, so collecting the material, and you can see that sometimes when we have a huge tree, we can take the slice with a chainsaw, but also we can try to get some information from the spot, from the in this case from the stump, analyzing the number of rings or the dimensions directly from the tree. Or in this case on the left, we take the samples from the buildings. We use here some drillers because it's easier than to do it manually. There is no science without statistics, of course, so we have such a concept as a response function, and this tool allows us to analyze the impact, the influence of various environmental features on our growth. On one hand, we have increment index, giving the information how big or how small the increment in a given year was, And on the other side of the equation, we have independent variables which hide the information about the environmental impact on the growth of our plant. And through the different various statistical procedures, we can elaborate coefficients that indicate which variable, each environmental parameter, influences the growth of plants in a significant way, or which impact is more important than the others. In dendroecology, we have many fields of interest. So we focus on fires, on twisters, on pest outbreaks, on various geomorphological processes, or even on volcanic eruptions. If I were to describe it in one word, I would use disturbance. Different disturbances, they affect the tree growth, which is driven by climate, mostly by climate, and they can change the process of growth substantially. And in dendroecology, we answer the questions you see on this slide. So we are interested what type of process, which process affected the tree, when it happened, where it happened, how often such a situation occurred. Was it single event or it reoccurs? If it happened, so how long the tree or the plant was under the influence of this process. And all this information can be found here, in this tiny piece of wood. As you can see, we have different colors, different structures here, different dimensions of the tree rings. All of these carry on the information about the environment and its impact on the plants. If we are talking about influence of the environment, we use very often such a concept, process-event response. As you can see on this graph, the concept is easy and seems to be very promising. But when we go deeper, looking for these arrows and lines, we see that the situation becomes very complex. One process can result in various events. And these events create different responses by the trees, by plants. And in some situations, it's easy that one event ends up with one response. But sometimes one event can give multiple responses. And also, one response can be attributed to different events. So it's not so easy that if I see, for example, a scar on a tree, I can't say that this is for sure fire, because it can also be flood or avalanche or other event. But we have couple of parameters that can be used to detect the impact of various environmental processes. And here I present some of them, but this list is not full, for sure. We can find much more different reactions of trees that appear as an effect, as a result of occurrence of kind of event or process. This graph shows 5 situations. So we lose the top of the tree, we get injured, we have scars on our trunks, the neighboring trees is eliminated, the tree is buried, the bottom part of the tree is buried, and the material that went down the slope tilts the tree. So the stem, the trunk is changed. And these processes, these events, create different responses in the tree ring structures. So decapitation or the stem burial cause abrupt growth suppression. Suddenly, tree rings became much narrower, and the tree produces very little wood. If we are talking about corrosion, so we are looking for scars. Scars and callous wood structures. Also, it's supported with raising ducts. We call them traumatic raising ducts because the disturbance creates some traumatic situation for the plant, and the raising is a response. For example, if we get scarred, species that produce resin try to cover this scar with resin just to protect themselves against fungi or other insects. If the neighboring trees are eliminated, particular tree got more space for growth, and the competition is reduced. So not so many competing specimen for the limited nutrition or resources are present, so the growth can be higher. So we observe the great increase, we call them abrupt growth release, increase in tree ring width. Tilting of the tree may end up with structures like eccentric growth. So on one side of the stem we observe wider rings than on the other. And also reaction wood, the wood which is of different color, of different anatomical features than the so-called normal wood or traditional wood. The disturbance, the response to the disturbance can be measured, comparing pre-disturbance, pre-event growth, and post-event growth. And we've got three parameters that can be used to assess whether a tree is resistant to the disturbance, whether it recovers quickly or slowly, and whether it's resilient to this is or was resilient to the disturbance. All these parameters can be used as an evaluation if the given disturbance was a severe or not, or was a light situation, or do our trees adapted to this changing environmental situation, or they suffered from this change. All these answers can be given by dendroecology. Okay, so let's look closer to some examples of application of dendroecology. So we start with climate as this most important factor influencing growth of the plants. Classical dendroecological, dendroclimatological analysis focus on relating climate conditions of a given place to the ring widths or other parameters. So here I present a study from northern Poland. You see this gray area. They collected historical wood from churches and other buildings, and the material covers the time span from 13th century up to now. These black bars here indicate individual trees, and you may follow the replication of certain periods. The climate station, which gave the data, was Bydgoszcz, indicated here in red. The classical dendroclimatological analysis products correlation coefficients between growth index and climate variables. On the left we've got temperature, on the right we've got precipitation. Those red triangles indicate significant coefficients, and if we look closer, we see that temperature of February and March of the current year means the year in which particular tree ring was developed. So the temperature in February and March have the positive influence on this ring formation, and here we've got negative influence of temperature in June. So positive influence means that the warmer, the wider ring. Negative means that too much warmth, too much heat causes narrower ring. As far as the precipitation is concerned, we've got significant correlation with May, June, July monthly values, which means that there is a positive influence of precipitation in vegetation period on the growth of Scots pine, because Scots pine is the species analyzed in this study. So we know that crucial conditions for the growth of these pines are temperature at the end of the winter and the beginning of spring, and temperature and precipitation in the vegetation period, understood as a time span from May to July. Knowing this, we may look closer to specific situations which can be revealed by pointer years. Also, the pointer years the analysis of pointer years was carried out here. On this left picture, you can see identification of pointer years in one of the centuries that was analyzed, and here there's a complex picture showing fraction of positive in red and negative in blue pointer years in consecutive 50 years periods. And as you can see, the frequency of pointer years, number of pointer years in total, and also the character of these years changes over the time. Sometimes there were more situations when the analyzed pines produced wider rings, and sometimes years when narrower structures were developed were more abundant. If we determine the pointer year, so we know the year and the character, whether it's positive or negative. We can check in the other sources if it's distant past. As you can see here, we've got years from the 17th century. So no climate record is available for this. No instrumental measurements are available for this period. We've got only some descriptions in diaries, in church books, or other documents, and we may try to find the information what caused such a pointer year in these sources. So, for example, let's see negative year in 1624 was probably caused by very warm and very dry previous July and August. And other sources reveal that the summer in West and Central Poland was very warm at that time. So probably we know that these Scots pines need a lot of precipitation during period from May to July. So when the summer was dry and warm, there was lack of moisture, lack of water, and the growth had to be limited. I said that we don't have measurements, instrumental measurements of climate variables for a distant past. What can we do in such a situation? We can apply dendroclimatology to reconstruct the climate parameters. So, basing on tree ring measurements here, we've got chronology spruce chronology from Romania, spanning from the beginning of this millennium and going back kind of 300 years. And usually the instrumental measurements are starting from 19th century, and in many places it's only 20th century or even after the Second World War. But trees or plants provide much longer record, and we can utilize it to reconstruct what climate, what temperature, what precipitation was in the past. The first step is to carry on dendrochronological analysis, just like presented on the previous slides. So we correlate climatic variables, temperature and precipitation, with our tree ring records. And we search for the significant coefficients. In that case, they decided to reconstruct winter temperature here, starting from November, the year previous to the ring formation, ending in January of the ring formation. So we utilize available climate data. We split it for the calibration period and verification period. For the calibration period, we carry on this climatic analysis, which results of which are presented here. And we compare in black, there is values predicted by the model, and in gray, actual values. It looks that our model, or the model developed by the authors of this study, works well, but it works well for the data that were used to the model construction. Luckily, we have another piece of the data which can be used as a verification. So we apply our climate model, and we compare what model predicts with what happened in reality. And as you can see, there are no big differences between the course of the winter temperature in reality and in what model predicts. So we can use our model to reconstruct the temperature in the past. So meteorological instrumental observations data was from 1960 up to 2000. And now, using tree ring data, using dendroclimatology, we can extend this information about winter temperature in Romania up to 1770. So let's say roughly 200 years more of the information. So that's the application of one of the applications of dendroecology. The other is, or can be, very, very useful when you want to build a house. When you want to have a house, you don't want it to be swept by the landslide or avalanche. So we can try to assess how often the landslides or avalanches happened, or basically determine whether given area is prone to landslides or not. And this study assesses the danger, the threat of the landslides in mountains of southern Poland. These white spots indicate places where the material for dendrochronological analysis were taken, and these grayish or yellowish parts indicate areas of landslides detected with geomorphological tools. So again, in this yellow color landslides, and color dots indicate study plots, and different color indicates different intensity of the occurrence of landslides episodes. So with blue, we've got a very rare landslides, like less than 1 or less than 2 events per 10 years. And this dark red says that more than 5 episodes of mass movement of the slopes appeared during 10 years. So we may say that every second year the land is moving, the land is sliding. So building a house in such a conditions is not the best solution. And here is the result map. So in color we see the danger, the threat of the landslides. The more intense color, the higher the danger. And these small spots here is current settlements. So if you look closer, or if you study the paper by Vistuba and Malik more carefully, you can see that some people build their houses on the slopes that are very active. And having such information, on one hand, can provide some support of the decision where to build, or if you are insurance company, you can rate how much people have to pay for the insurance. The other application of the dendroecology is to get some information about pest outbreaks. This is a serious problem for the foresters, for example, when various insects attack stands and eat foliage, for example, and causes some losses, economical losses in the economy. We may distinguish some macroscopic features that indicate pest outbreak, but not always such approach is sufficient. So here you can see that there are structures indicated here with arrows of very narrow latitude. So this darker part of the tree ring is very thin. And when it was compared with the outbreaks of pests, it turned out that these were the years when some foliage eaters destroyed the stands. They ate the foliage, and the growth was reduced, especially in these later part of the growing season, and trees had no enough energy to produce these thicker walls of the late wood. The lower panel presents the study on large butmouth gradations in Switzerland, and we can see here in the background the cross section, the slice, the anatomical slice made from the wood of the larch, and these black lines here, this is a profile of the density, the maximum density, and here we can see a small increase, which on one hand could be assessed as an intra-annual density fluctuation, but if we look closer and analyze this situation, it appears that it's not fluctuation within 1 year. This is totally another ring, a ring that was formed in 1944. What happened to these trees? There was an outbreak of large butmouth, and how we know it? The researchers analyzed the behavior of this large butmouth and looked for the features in tree rings that were able to be identified as caused by this large butmouth appearance. And it turned out that large butmouth outbreaks happen usually every 8 or every 9 years. So using this information that the interval between 2 consecutive outbreaks is kind of 8 or 9 years, we could find that this peak of the density is individual tree ring, individual year, and not the intra-annual density fluctuation. Another example, this time human activity, so impact of the industrial pollution. We've got the company that produces veneer, and a lot of dust is created by this factory, and we analyzed whether it influences or not the growth of Scots pine. So we've got the reference site here, west from the factory, because in Poland the prevailing wind direction is from the west. So the winds, we suppose that winds remove the pollution which is above the plant, more in the east direction. So the site that is located on the west is free from the pollution. We've got site close to the plant, which we assumed to be heavy contaminated, and the other one which is in a certain distance from the plant, and we assumed that it is less contaminated, or maybe it will not be impacted by this pollution. And here on these lower panels you can see the growth curves of on these 3 sides, and red one is average chronology, row chronology for these sides, and we can see that more or less B and C sides, so these assumed to be contaminated, polluted, they exhibit similar curves of the growth. And the A, the control side, has a little bit different strategy or curves of this tree-ring width over the time. And when we compared average tree-ring width before plant construction, this is this upper panel, and after the plant construction, the lower panel, we see that in the first case trees grew similarly. There was no significant difference between the sides. And in the period of the influence of the plant, this side B here, close to the plant, has the lowest values of mean tree-ring width, and we assume that it's the indication of the impact. So the growth was reduced by the dust and other pollution coming from the plant. Forest fires are very spectacular and dangerous disturbances, and I want here to present you some research from the Białowieża forest in the eastern Poland, and we've got here the reconstruction of the event of fire events in, let's say, 3 or 3.5 years. Each black point or black dot on these lines is a situation where scar was found on the trees and was dated. This black vertical black horizontal lines are individual trees, and as you can see, some trees have 1, maybe 2 scars, the others have much more. And in general, in the past times, these scars were more abundant, so more fires appeared in Białowieża forest. And here we can see that almost every analyzed tree suffered from the fire and was scarred by the fire. And this allows to reconstruct how often and how severe the fires in the Białowieża forest were. And here we have information about the fire interval, or interval, the time span between 2 consecutive events. And as you analyze this table, you can see that mean length of the interval rises over the time. So at the beginning, back in the past, 17th century, fires happened like every 8 years, then every 5 years, and in the last 100 years of the analysis, it was a huge increase in this length of the fire interval up to almost 30 years. So the fire, the intense fire which scared the trees, happened every 30 years, on average, of course. And this can also be used to reconstruct the regeneration of different species in Białowieska forest in this case. Similarly, we can analyze floods. This time floods in the Tatra Mountains, southern Poland. We also analyze scars, but this time not fire scars, but scars caused by the rocks carried out, transported by water. So streams, in case of huge rainfalls, carry on very heavy rocks because they have a lot of water, and this transportation power of water is in such a situation much higher than usually. So these heavy rocks can hit and injure trees growing on the stream banks or river banks. And dating such scars, we can reconstruct how often such events appeared. And we can also, like in this case, correlate events when scars were made on trees. So similarly to the fire analysis, we've got vertical lines that represent horizontal, again, lines that represent trees, and dots that represent scars. And here we have huge event which injured a lot of trees. And when we compare this number of or fraction of scars with precipitation, information about the precipitation, we see that in this year there was huge amount of precipitation. And this probably caused a flood that was able to take heavy rocks that injured these trees. So these were the examples, small examples of application of various dendrochronological analysis. If you are interested in more details, just go through the very classic literature like Tree Rings and Climate by Hall Fritz, or Tree Rings and Environment, Dendroecology by Fritz Schweingruber, or more recently published books or articles about these studies. Thank you for your attention.